agencies, private foundations, and nonprofits. From 1978 through 1991, he served as a full-time elected official, spending 11 years in the Connecticut State Legislature, holding several leadership positions. For the final 2 years, he served as mayor of Middletown, Connecticut. Paul has been a member of the adjunct faculty of both Wesleyan University and Trinity College, and served on multiple state and national nonprofit boards for organizations dealing with people with mental illness, substance use disorders, and developmental disabilities. He's a graduate of Wesleyan University and lives with his wife, Pam, in Middletown, Connecticut. They have 4 adult children and 2 grandchildren. On behalf of Wendy DePedro, the CEO of Mental Health Association of Monmouth, myself, and our team, we welcome and thank Paul for joining us today.
Thank you, Maureen. It's a real pleasure to be here with you. I so appreciate this invitation to participate today and to spend just a couple of minutes sharing some thoughts with your audience. This has certainly been an extraordinary time for us all. I keep trying to imagine what it was like 3 months ago and all of the plans I had at that point for the way Mental Health Month was going to be. I actually expected to be with you all in person a couple of weeks ago doing a celebration among many other things that I had scheduled and planned for this month. But instead I find myself, sitting in my office, and you can't see the view that I have because the camera's pointing at me, but I look out over my backyard, which has gone from brown to green, and just kind of gone from winter to summer here at the same time, and wondering kind of where these days have gone and where these days may be going. I really do think that the focus today on hope is really an important one, because at Mental Health America, we've always had that focus. We say that our mission has been to work on prevention for all and early identification and intervention for those at risk, integrated services for people who need them, with recovery as the goal. And I think that fourth part of recovery is critically important to us all today. We've been through a shocking trauma, and we've observed this at Mental Health America at the national level. Thousands more people have used our screening tools. Hundreds of thousands of people have used our website. We've seen scores of people day in and day out who are screening with depression, with anxiety, and worse, and have wondered at times, what it was going to take and how it was going to be that we all would work our way through this. The truth is, we're still facing a lot of uncertainty. I'm in Connecticut, you're in New Jersey. We know that in this area, things seem to be settling down a bit, giving us a chance to take a deep breath and look forward. But in other areas of the country, this pandemic is still building, and we have no idea whether it's going to continue to build throughout the summer and come back with a vengeance again in the fall. But even if it does, the important things we need to be doing today is preparing for how we move beyond this and preparing for how we think about our futures. There is uncertainty, and we've all gotten a healthy dose of the limitations we all have to control our environment, to control our lives. But again, what we see happening at Mental Health America is a greater emphasis than we've had certainly in a generation on the mental health of the population as a whole. We've had a greater recognition on the part of everybody that while we may not all be in the same boat, we are certainly, rowing in the same ocean here. And I think we have seen an increasing understanding on the part of community leaders, public officials, and others that now is the time to invest in our mental health, because in so doing, we will be investing in our overall health and in our overall futures. So this is an important day, just as this has been an important series. We're coming to the end of Mental Health Month right now. And this has been our biggest mental health month ever, where we focus on the mental health of the population, not always just the mental health concerns of the population. As we come to the end of Mental Health Month, it's really the new year for mental health in America. It's really the beginning of the next set of stages we've got. And I think we can approach these stages with as much optimism as we can gather, with as much hope as we can have, with as much appreciation for the opportunities that still are in front of us to do better for our own mental health and well-being, and better for the health, mental health, and well-being of the entire population. So thanks for letting me join you today, and thanks for letting me do this greeting. I appreciate it, and I'm glad to be with you.
Thank you so much, Paul. I think those words inspire us as we have to move ahead, which we know can be a challenge. I want to continue by having us take a look at our concept, which is something we've come up with every week. And what I wanted to do was I wanted to start talking a little bit broader about our concept for this entire webinar series. I think you've probably noticed that this has really been theory-based with practical application. Many of you have commented on that in your evaluations. Many of us, members of the team, have been in university settings, still are in university settings, but we live in the community. So we understand the importance of taking research and evaluation and translating it to community application. We've tried to approach these topics from slightly different perspectives than other webinars you may have been in. I don't know if it was just the Kenny Chesney and the nuts on the frosting, but we try to go in different places, and you all seem to have noticed that as well. This week, we're going to start with a concept that we've covered before, and this is the fact that we're as impacted as our clients, because this is going to be a chronic stressor. This is a marathon that's composed of sprints, and the sprints don't seem to have much time between the races. The concept of taking care of ourselves as caregivers was something that I think was recognized nationally after September 11th with first responders. But if you think about it, it wasn't just what they'd been through, but what they needed to continue to do. That really was the recognition that we have to continue to care for ourselves if we're going to be of any use to the people we serve. So our plan today is we are going to talk about that personal cost. It is the most overlooked element in trauma care, so we're going to weave that in and out throughout our day. We're going to talk a little bit about the difference between trauma and distress, mental or emotional distress, because we've spoken a lot about trauma, but we want to emphasize that not everybody you talk with or not everybody affected by COVID is going to be traumatized. Certainly some people are, but many more people are going to experience what we're calling emotional distress. So we want to introduce that into the conversation today. And obviously we've talked about hope, and I was so glad to hear Paul mention that. Especially we've talked about lending hope as a therapeutic intervention. We want to expand that concept today and talk about using metaphor, which in some ways can be the language of hope. So we want to give you some of those skills to add to your toolkit. Talk a little bit about the difference between the resilience concept and post-traumatic growth, and then suggest some things for you to focus on until we meet again. And so what we're going to do right now is come up for air with a wonderful metaphor that Laura is going to introduce to us.
It's a pleasure to be here. We've chosen a poem to begin with. I think it's a funny poem, but really about the juxtaposition of loss and beauty in our lives. And it's Relax by Ellen Bass, easily accessible online. Relax. Bad things are going to happen. Your tomatoes will grow a fungus and your cat will get run over. Someone will leave the bag with the ice cream melting in the car and throw your blue cashmere sweater in the dryer. Your husband will sleep with a girl your daughter's age, her breasts spilling out of her blouse. Or your wife will remember she's a lesbian and leave you for the woman next door. The other cat, the one you never really liked, will contract a disease that requires you to pry open its feverish mouth every 4 hours for a month. Your parents will die. No matter how many vitamins you take, how much Pilates, you lose your keys, your hair, and your memory. If your daughter doesn't plug her heart into every live socket she passes, You'll come home to find your son has emptied your refrigerator, dragged it to the curb, and called the used appliance store for a pickup. Drug money. There's a Buddhist story of a woman chased by a tiger. When she comes to a cliff, she sees a sturdy vine and climbs halfway down. But there's also a tiger below, and 2 mice, one white, one black. At this point, she notices a wild strawberry growing from a crevice. She looks up, down at the mice. Then she eats the strawberry. So here's the view: the breeze, the pulse in your throat. Your wallet will be stolen. You'll get fat, slip on the bathroom tiles of a foreign hotel, and crack your hip. You'll be lonely. Oh, taste how sweet and tart the red juice is, how the tiny seeds crunch between your teeth. Marnie's going to come on and ask us to take a poll.
Yes, hi guys. So we are asking you to think about the strawberry from that poem and think about what are your strawberries. The poll says, what are things you find or seek along the way to bring sweetness, relief, and pleasure? Go ahead, check off as many of those that you consider your own personal strawberries as you'd like. As usual, go into the chat. If you go in the chat, remember to do it to all panelists and attendees so everyone can see what they are. And we'll take a look and see what you guys think. Someone just wrote the light coming in my window. That's a great strawberry. Mm-hmm. A good podcast, spending time with my pet. Messages in Dove chocolate. Maureen, you like the Dove chocolate part.
Yes.
All right. We have just over 100 people responding to the poll. I'm going to give it another minute because people are really weighing in. My children listening to the birds in the morning. My son, not a fan of that. He just tweeted that, that he's learned that birds start singing at 4:30 in the morning and don't stop. The sound of a stream running, a good book. Okay, we are full of strawberries in this group. I'm going to share the results so you can see. The sunny day, which today is here in New Jersey, was the biggest favorite of everyone. Taking a walk, a call with a friend. You know, I wanted to share that one shelter-in-place strawberry that I haven't found yet, but I'm on the lookout for, is one of those painted rocks that people are painting and leaving around. I'm still hopeful during shelter-in-place that I'll stumble upon that strawberry. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing this. Thanks for sharing strawberries, and we're going to go on. Maureen is going to take us into a little bit more about metaphor.
Thanks, Marnie. I wanted to say a little bit more about metaphor. We've infused it into the content of kind of everything we're saying today. So if you listen closely, you'll hear we use a lot of metaphor because metaphor is the language of imagination. If you think back to those fairy tales you read as a child, you may be reading them to your children or grandchildren now, those were metaphors for the way life was supposed to evolve. I know that there were a lot of them that had that happily ever after at the end of it. I never have quite found that one, but perhaps some of you have. And what metaphors do is they speak both to the conscious and the unconscious, and they allow you to define your own meaning for it. You can read it at whatever level you choose. You can read it on the superficial. It could have been simply a strawberry, or it could be something that perhaps gave you hope. It also gives you the opportunity to provide some emotional distance from difficult topics so you can feel safe. When we were working with our 9/11 families, we created a series of short stories for the children and families, and we used metaphor to kind of describe what was happening to them in their lives. And the one we had that was really talking about the towers had a story about a snow globe that was accidentally dropped and broke. So kids could choose to read that as the story about the snow globe, or they could choose to read it about what had happened in their lives and that was broken. It helped them widen their focus, and it helps kind of get some sense of perspective. In my work, I think about the metaphor that I used a lot was a metaphor for catastrophize. I would often try to find metaphors for complicated psychological concepts because I kind of feel like I certainly know children don't often get them, but I think even adults, you know, when we're feeling emotionally a little fragile, we don't necessarily think at the most abstract level. So for the term catastrophize and catastrophic thinking, the metaphor that I often use was the metaphor of a snowball avalanche. I would talk to people about how they'd made a snowball. It wasn't a snowflake. I didn't want to diminish the intensity of it, because for some people a snowball could be this big, but what they had done with that snowball was push it down the mountain and turn it into an avalanche. And I would often say, wow, that really took a lot of energy to make that snowball into an avalanche. How did you do this? What it did was, it wasn't just talking about the fact that they were catastrophizing, but it visualized a way they could understand how it was happening. And often people would come back the next week and say, oh, you are not going to believe how good I was at starting a few avalanches, but there was one I stopped. So it gave that perspective in a very concrete way. It also, I think, kind of talks to us about some of our personal costs, because I know that sometimes we have avalanches in our life. Our capacity for empathy as people who care for others makes us profoundly vulnerable to being affected and possibly damaged by the work we do. And here are 3 of the ways that can happen. Secondary trauma, as you probably know, is defined as indirect exposure to trauma through the first-hand account or the narrative of a traumatic event by someone else. This vivid recounting is something that we as the helpers internalize, and we actually may have some reactions that are parallel to post-traumatic stress. We might do some re-experiencing, some avoidance, some hyperarousal. Compassion fatigue refers to the profound emotional and physical erosion that takes place when we as helpers aren't able to refuel and regenerate. It's too much, it's too constant, we can't come up for enough air, it's too many of those sprints, one after another after another. Vicarious traumatization was a term that was coined in the mid-1990s. And it was coined about workers who had clients who were sexually assaulted, physically abused, domestic abuse victims, child abuse victims. And these helpers noticed that they were having their fundamentals, beliefs about the world altered and possibly damaged because they were so exposed to this traumatic material repeatedly. And you know, I want to share kind of for myself how I came in touch with that. It was after September 11th. A lot of my colleagues went to work at Ground Zero, and it was kind of the impetus to volunteer to go over there and help, because obviously the folks there needed lots of help. But I stepped back from it a little bit and recognized that if I chose to go to Ground Zero, I was worried that that vivid setting was going to give me some vicarious traumatization, and I would be unable to work with children and families who had lost someone that day, because I might get derailed. And this is what I kind of thought some of my getting derailed would look like. Being there in that intense environment where so many people had died, I thought might compromise my ability to really deny one client's traumatic experience of death, that all of it would just sort of inure me to what that one loss was like. And I thought, because it might be a little bit overwhelming to me, I might start pushing a client too fast to master that traumatic response. And I choose the word master here very intentionally, because you have to master that and you have to trust in the process. Most people get where they need to be when they're ready to be there. It's like pushing a river. You can't force them to be there too soon. I was also concerned that my exposure to that might disrupt the therapeutic alliance. Again, I didn't quite know how I could be close to someone who had one loss when I had been so exposed to multiple losses, and that I might violate that therapeutic boundary of radical availability that Nicole talked about last time with folks who might be struggling with suicide, that I might forget I needed to make arrangements for either myself or someone else or some crisis line to be available for my clients 24/7. And as you can hear as I'm talking, my own views of safety and trust would have been violated. And I knew I couldn't figure out how to help others until I figured out how to help myself. And I will tell you, in some of the weeks when we ran groups for families, we would have to hold a special session for us, the helpers, prior to the group, because we knew the concepts and the things that were coming up that week were so traumatic for us that we had to really kind of work them through before we could help families. That was one time in particular when they had moved the scaffolding at ground zero and they had found lots of remains, and we knew a lot of our families had had remains found. And so we had to come in early and work with ourselves to help them through that. And in fact, we also knew that we might result to some of that unhealthy COVID type coping, which was quarantinis. When you're working with people with COVID, the translation of that, I think, is that if you're working with people who have more than one person who has lost someone, you need to pay attention to that one person who has had the loss, and don't overwhelm yourself with too many deaths. I think that, for example, the front page of the New York Times on Sunday that was just covered with the name of deceased was pretty overwhelming for me, and made it hard for me to just focus on the one thing I had to focus on. So what do? You try to balance your caseload and have enough supervision or consultation. I will tell you, in times like this, asking for clinical help is not a sign of strength, is a sign of strength, excuse me, not a sign of weakness. And you've got to have your own physical space and time to come up for air. And, you know, now that we're coming out of shelter in place, it might be a little easier to get there, but sometimes it isn't quite so easy. So I'll share my solution. I happen to like tropical climates and rainforests. So I would just go in the bathroom, close the door, turn the shower on, turn the light out, listen to the rain, feel the humidity build in the environment, and I could imagine myself someplace else. Marnie's going to talk with us a little bit more about creating those safe spaces. You have to not just respect your own limits, but you got to identify them. That was why it was so important for me to identify what my limits were, and really to figure out how I was going to have some social connection, which often I get from contact comfort with my dog. So those are some of the things you need to do for yourself. Marnie is going to now take us through some of the difference between trauma and emotional distress.
Thanks. So we've talked about trauma, I think, every week. This is the definition we've used. I'm going to give you a minute just to read it to refresh yourself on it. So now what I want to do is introduce the concept of mental or emotional distress. Mental and emotional distress is a disturbing state, often impairing your ability to cope with daily living. So distress actually hasn't been studied a great deal, but it's already starting to get more attention in the current environment. Time magazine in early May carried a story about the increase in mental distress in Americans. Researchers at San Diego State University and Florida State University have a study in preprint right now that found that 70% of Americans are currently experiencing moderate to severe mental distress. This is triple the distress levels that they found in 2018 when they did a similar study. This increase probably doesn't come as a surprise to all of you who are witnessing it firsthand in clients. The reason we wanted to bring distress into the conversation today is because while not everyone is experiencing trauma in our collective trauma situation, in the past several months, many of us have experienced emotional distress. And although SAMHSA guidelines for emotional distress and disasters say that most symptoms are temporary and will resolve on their own in a fairly short amount of time, that guidance is not speaking to what's happening right now with us when we're in the middle of an ongoing disaster. I mean, months, 3 months now, months now. Alleviating symptoms of emotional or mental distress when the disaster is continuing can feel a lot like bailing out a boat while the hole is not yet plugged, which is exactly why Maureen is going to give us some guidance in handling distress.
Thanks, Barney. And one of the things you all reminded us in the evaluations is you didn't like it when I just talked. You liked it when it was written. So we're going to write these for you. The first one, if you go back to our first session, and remember we talked about the inner and the outer community. And one of the things that kind of folds into what we're talking about today is that that outer community continues to be extraordinarily distressed. And it's important to not let that inner sense of self get affected. And it may be that what you're going to recommend for both your clients and yourself is that you don't watch so much of the news. It tends to be a preoccupation with what's happening. If it's not preoccupation with what's happening with COVID, it's about other stories that seem even worse. So you may want to titrate your dose of that. You also want to recognize that there are some people who tolerate distress better than others. Research has shown that people who are open to experience, who are emotionally responsive, intellectually curious, often do better in meeting the challenge of adversity. So what does this mean for you? You want to get background information about previous distress with your clients to size them up. Because you can then give them realistic hope from their history about how they're going to get through this. Even yourself, look back, see what you've been through, and you can use that to kind of remind yourself you're going to get through this today. In terms of expanding therapeutic goals, most of the literature on triumph over adversity involves concepts that we don't necessarily consider as clinical. They may be more metaphysical or existential, like the development of greater patience, tolerance, courage, or changing in values or life priorities. We'll talk about those a little bit more when we talk about post-traumatic growth. All of these, though, can have an impact on the quality of life. So I want to suggest that you might feel more optimistic if you open yourself up to the possibility of introducing these concepts as some of the therapeutic goals that you set for your clients and you set together. As clients struggle to find meaning, they may also, as we talked about before, struggle with some of their spiritual beliefs. And you have to incorporate that conversation about religious and spiritual beliefs into your work with them if you're not doing that already. Because you may have some people who have that spiritual disenfranchisement. And for some, that spiritual dimension is where they get their hope. I'll share an example with you because this was so telling for me. I worked with a couple who had lost both of their children to tragic accidents when they were in their 20s. And both of the parents had been very religious prior to these accidents. After the accident, the father was still able to hold on to his religious ballast. That could hold him. But his wife really went into one of those periods of spiritual disenfranchisement. She couldn't understand how God would let this happen to them. So in order to support them, I had to reach out to other resources other than myself so that they could get some of that spiritual repair, especially for the wife. Now, I knew that most likely they weren't going to ever get back on the same page, but eventually they were able to get back in the same chapter, in the same book, and at least have some way that they could communicate with each other. The last thing we have on this is that idea of a safe place, which obviously you can see is my being in the bathroom with the shower on. Marnie's going to talk to us a little bit about that.
Great. So we're focusing our minds from the outer community to the inner sense of self can be easier if we've already created a safe place in our imagination. Imagining a happy and safe place, either somewhere we've been or somewhere we've never been but really would like to be, can ease the feelings of distress. To do this effectively, detail is important. Like Maureen's, steamy, the steamier it gets, the more she feels she's in that rainforest. The more senses you can include, the better. It can become your place of shelter. You can have clients draw their places or make collages or just describe them in detail. My safe place is a lake house from my childhood. I can hear the gentle lap of the lake. I can feel the warmth of the sand on my feet. And I can smell that not so great musty lake water smell. Just describing it calms me down, settles me every time.
So we've given you a couple examples of safe places. Now we want to talk a little bit about how we come up for air with hope. And I know you may think we're beating a dead horse here by talking about hope in almost every session, but this is really the essence of moving forward, because hope is a concept that's related in futurity. It's the perceived accessibility of some desired goal in the future. It differs from optimism or pessimism in that it includes not just what we expect to happen if we get to that goal, but also we imagine ways to get there. And why this is so helpful is that our brain pumps neurochemicals when we're experiencing that sensation of hope, those endorphins that come up just like morphine. So the result is that our brain can overcome hurdles and move us to a place of recovery that we just don't get any other way. And this does not have to be some grand and glorious hope. It can happen in very little ways. And Marnie is going to share a story she noticed during the week about some hope in one of her children. So go for it, Marnie.
Great. So my youngest is a student athlete in college, and his season, like so many college athletes, was ended by a pandemic just as it was starting. He's been home making do, just like everyone. Last week, though, Coach told the team that not only had he gotten the alumni to buy the team brand new jerseys for next season, but those jerseys are going to say downtown across the chest instead of the college's name. So downtown is a nickname the baseball program has given themselves, and they're kind of crazy about it. They think they sound extra cool when they have their downtown on. So the coach and the alumni put into motion concrete plans for next year's season. And in doing so, my son and his teammates are now talking about when, not if, they play together again. That's hope.
Thanks, Marn. So what are you going to do with your clients? How do you use this? How do you give them hope? First of all, I want you to remember, and this is just what we talked about last week when we talked about suicide and crisis, that you already have the skills to reach out and deal with suicide, even if you didn't know them. With every client you see or every student you work with, you're focusing on goal attainment in the face of obstacles. So you do this all the time. This is nothing different. You want to listen for those threads of hope in what clients tell you. It may seem buried to them, so you may have to help them kind of pick it out. Like, for example, what I heard you tell me is that you'd like to use this opportunity that you're getting now from working at home to come up with a more satisfying career path in the future. Let's talk about how we might be able to do that. So you can see how we've sort of moved ourselves to that next concept of those joining words we've talked about. Let's see if we can do this together. And what you're giving them is what we call a concept of borrowed hope. We've been talking about it in the therapeutic way of lending hope, but it's when someone doesn't have help for themselves, you give them some of yours, and they can borrow it until they get their own hope to see them through. The other thing about that borrowed hope, however, it really focuses on the immediate future. Don't go long term. That's when you'll make a mistake, because you want to start to look at those small successes that people make after trauma. Sometimes next week is too far. It may be, what can you do in the next hour or in the next day? And whatever those accomplishments are, you want to reinforce them consistently. Remember, hopes are kind of like flowers. They need to be nurtured and watered to grow. Some of your clients will have the capacity to nurture their hopes themselves, but if they can't, you can do that for them. And you also want to remember, especially in this time of uncertainty, that you have to adjust expectations as necessary. When we're in uncertain times, we don't talk about sliding backwards. We talk about keeping pace. You have to remember that sometimes flowers have too much rain and they're not going to grow. So the fact that they don't grow has nothing to do with the accomplishments you've made. It's just that it's the climate you're in. So we want to now go to another one of our famous polls.
All right. So this poll is where you find hope. So go ahead. Where do you find hope? We gave some suggestions. You know, I want to see your suggestions in chat. I know it helps everyone else to get the ideas. I think these are some good ideas, and share the chat. You know, take some notes after you've indicated yours, because what we think is that this is an activity that you can do with clients to help them identify and maybe add to their own list of sources of hope. Music, someone just wrote. Books on hope. Yes, reading books on hope is a great one. Through family connections, attending these webinars. They've given me hope, these webinars. Watching children play, baby laughter. All right, I'm gonna wrap up the poll and share what you guys saw. So helping others came in first as a source of hope. We're gonna talk about that a little bit more when we talk about post-traumatic growth and how it can, an outcome of trauma can be the need and the desire to help others and take care of others. I see that's very popular. Being at the ocean, you know, those of us who live in New Jersey, there's nothing like the ocean. Prayer and meditation, talking with people who are optimistic. I mean, selecting who we spend time with certainly will make a difference in how hopeful we can be. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing the poll, because now it's time for us to turn this over to Laura, who's going to talk about finding hope in poetry and metaphor.
Okay, I want to talk briefly about the qualities of the literature of the last 100 years, which is my area, certainly in English, but in other languages as well. And I think the characteristics of the literature relate directly to what we're talking about in terms of hope. One, the literature is about hope amidst great suffering. And it's often about how to survive and thrive after the worst has happened. It's a recognition of a profound before and after. We certainly have a before and after, you know, in our last 3 months. There's a recognition of a profound beauty in brokenness, in fragmentation, and the recognition of voices previously absent or silenced in the lit, and that could have to do with race, class, gender, sexuality, religious belief, whatever it might be. Everybody gets a voice. And then, of course, the most important in some ways is how readers must actively participate in the creation of meaning, which I think is what we're asking you to do today. So I have 5 points that I want to say for our working with poetry today and maybe afterward, okay? It often gets a bad rap because it's not often taught well. There are no hidden meanings in poems. A poet doesn't write a poem and then get a bucket of hidden meanings and dump it in. Poems are complex because our inner and outer lives are complex. For the purposes of our work together, there are no right or wrong answers when we talk about poems. Former US poet laureate Billy Collins suggests that every poem should have a door or at least a window, some way in. Now, not all poems speak to all of us. Lord knows, 38 years of teaching, I've found that to be true, okay? But for our purposes, when you read a poem, okay, look for a line or a word that speaks to you. You don't have to make sense of the whole poem, okay? Poets do, as Maureen said, give us a language for hope. So I have some words from, here's Mark Doty, poet and memoirist, about making language. He says in a brilliant new book on Walt Whitman, I recommend it, just came out this month, poetry exists to find words for what resists easy naming. We are most often driven to write or read it when any other sort of language can seem incapable of the work required. So that important aspect of the poet naming, trying to reach to find a language for mystery, certainly a language for uncertainty, certainly a language for difficult questions. The next writer is Nobel laureate Seamus Heaney, who writes in an essay, if our given experience is a labyrinth, then its impassability is countered by the poet's imagining some equivalent of the labyrinth and bringing himself and the reader through it. So that labyrinth, that maze, you know, where there are dead ends and one has to turn around. I think we're in labyrinth time right now. And poetry, and by extension, any kind of art that speaks to us, can explore those labyrinths and help us find our way out of the maze and into full life. Now, one of my favorite, and I'm going to ask you to think about what words resonate in this quotation from Mary Oliver, because there'll be a poll, okay? Poetry is prayer. It is passion and story and music. It is beauty, comfort. It is agitation, declaration. It is thanksgiving. Some poems are radiant and oracular. Some are quiet and full of tenderness, like a letter written to a friend. Often poetry is the gate to a new life, or sometimes the restoration of an old world gone. It brings new thoughts or the welcome remembrances of old ones. It offers simple pleasure, complicated joy, and even at times healing. So I'll turn it over to Marnie, and she can do a poll on.
Excellent. So I love that passage. We're fans of Mary Oliver in general, and this is a great passage. What we're asking you right now is what words in that passage spoke to you? The idea here being that you don't have to digest the whole passage at once, just what really stood out for you. What's your entry into this passage? So people are right, go ahead. If I didn't catch one and something really stood out for you, prayer, someone just put in the chat. You guys know what to do. You do it right every time. Radiance. People are still checking in here. Comfort and healing are kind of neck and neck right now, in case that influences your vote. All right, I'm going to wrap this one up. A lot of people felt like prayer really spoke to them in this one. Okay, so I'm going to share the results. We can see that comfort and healing actually came in, wait, I'm not sharing yet, as a tie. So that's just a great example of how one passage can speak to all of us differently. I think a lot of people took away one different thing because we're all coming at these passages from different places. Before moving to resilience, I do want to take a moment to make sure that each of you at some point take a look in the workbook. We compiled lines from all of our favorite poems, and I typed them up and put them in one place. And what I noticed when I did that was that the underpinning of all of our favorite lines had something to do with hope. Because I think hope is something we need a little extra of right now. And even when we didn't mean to, we couldn't help but put in hope in our favorite lines of poems. So I'm gonna go ahead and stop sharing those results. And I'm moving us on to resilience. So, resilience. We can, I think, just go, yep, perfect, thanks. So resiliency is the ability to bounce back in the face of adversity, which we ordinarily may expect to overwhelm people's coping resources. Resiliency, in other words, is when people are able to adapt and recover from stressful situations or reconfigure their thoughts, beliefs, and behaviors to adjust to ongoing and changing demands. Resilience to stress, I want to emphasize here, is a process. It's an interaction between us and our environments. It is not a static characteristic or a personality trait. What's really great about that is we don't need to classify ourselves or other people as resilient or not resilient people. We can all work towards having resilient moments and resilient reactions to our circumstances. I'm going to turn it over to Laura so I can come up for air for a moment, and she's going to share with us a beautiful poem.
Mary Oliver is really one of our great contemporary poets of hope. And I have the blessing to invite her to the college, and she came, and then a blessing that we became friends. Okay, so she talks here about how you perceive the world. Praying. It doesn't have to be the blue iris. It could be weeds in a vacant lot or a few small stones. Just pay attention, then patch a few words together, and don't try to make them elaborate. This isn't a contest, but the doorway into thanks and a silence in which another voice may speak. So now I'll turn it over to Maureen.
Because I wanted to just say a little bit about this poem, because it really does speak to me, and I think it addresses that vision. You know, you look at irises and weeds and stones, and what we talked about in the very beginning is how our vision of the world may be compromised by compassion fatigue or vicarious traumatization, and it does change our vision of the world. So I think it's really, really important for you to find something that speaks to your soul, you can identify that vision, and it's important to really fiercely guard it and protect it. It's essential to enhancing your clinical skills as much as taking a CEU course, because it really is what lets you hold on in the face of adversities. Those of you who know me well, maybe don't even know me well, but know, and I will try to show you, I actually have a blue iris that's tattooed on my wrist. It didn't actually come from this poem, happens to be my favorite flower, but when my vision of the world gets blurry, as it has often, you know, doing the work that I have done through the years, looking at that iris and touching it gives me a sense of continuity, and it really does calm my voice and center me back on the things that are wild and free and make my life valuable to me. So that becomes my doorway into thanks. And what we want for you is to think about what your doorway into thanks is. What keeps you steady and grounded when the times kind of get a little rocky under you? So we want you to think about that. And I'm going to turn this back to Marnie now, who's going to give us some more practical information about resilience.
Yeah, so I think that one of the things that makes it easier to have resilient moments is to have an understanding that there's different kinds of resiliency. It's not one size fits all. So we're going to look at all three of these today: resistance, recovery, and reconfiguration. So resistance can look like denial or avoidance. But it can be a helpful form of resilience. Resistance looks a lot like this phone pole right here. It's standing tall and firm and unchanged. But sometimes the most effective form of resilience is to resist the disruption and remain unchanged. The right time for resistance can be when disruptions are small, like maybe a lost hamster in your house, or when they don't directly impact you, like probably a lot of what you're seeing on the national news. Resistance is also an important type of resilience in first responders who must continue on with their work despite being witness or a part of really difficult experiences and disruptive experiences. As clinicians, I would say this is a skill you learn in your training so that you can respond but not react to things that you are told. Like the phone pole, we can stand tall and firm. However, this tends to only work for so long. We need space between disruptions that we resist, and we need to allow time for healing. Otherwise, this pole is going to come down. Which leads me to another form of resiliency, recovery, where we adapt and then recover from stressful situations. Elasticity and flexibility are important aspects of this. It's about bending and then resuming normal life, bouncing back. Maureen is always grateful, like the tree in the picture here, that the trees in her yard in Texas can bend and sway with the 60-mile-per-hour winds of a thunderstorm, and then afterwards return to homeostasis. Recovery resilience works great when, for example, you have a broken leg and have to learn how to get around on crutches. You adapt until you're healed, and then you can walk on your own again. Many of us have been bending while adjusting to the challenges of shelter in place. And I'm noticing as states begin to open up how anxious and eager many people are to bounce back to the way things were. You may have seen that photo of a bar crowded with people in the Lake of the Ozarks this weekend. That's a good visual of bouncing back, returning to homeostasis. Some people, however, feel that after shelter in place, we can't go back to the way things were. Instead, we're going to need to move to a new normal, which brings us to reconfiguration, when an individual adapts to stressors and changes so that future stressors are easier to handle. If recovery is bouncing back, reconfiguration can be seen as bouncing forward. This requires us to bend and then reconfigure our thoughts, our beliefs, and our behaviors to adjust to ongoing and changing demands. Sounds a lot like what our post-pandemic world is going to be like, right? Now, the thing is, reconfiguration can require a lot of inner resources. It takes time and work. It can wear us out to reconfigure all the time. And what's important to know is there's excellent times still for resistance and recovery. This is not, reconfiguration isn't the gold standard of resilience and the other ones don't count. There's always time for resistance and recovery too. What I want to highlight is that since resiliency is a process that we employ in response to stressors, not just a characteristic, but something we actively do, we can choose and we can educate our clients to choose the right form of resiliency for the job. We don't want to deplete valuable inner resources using reconfiguration when the hamster goes missing or we've broken a leg. Now, Maureen is going to talk a lot about fostering resilience. And so it's there when you need it.
So I'm going to kind of build on what Marnie has said, is first of all, to remember resiliency is not all or nothing. It isn't that static characteristic. It's very fluid. And so having both fluidity and flexibility can help us really be more resilient. I think a lot of people have the wrong definition of this, and they think if they don't have it in one area of their life, it's missing. The second piece on here, though, I think is interesting, because I think for a lot of us in the normal work we do as therapy, we may not be necessarily providing action steps to our clients. We kind of let them find their way and figure that out on their own. But I think, especially in this time of pandemic, if you've got clients who seem to be stepping in the same hole 47 times, you don't want them to step in that same hole 48 times. You may need to provide them with some direction and some action steps about exactly what to do. This is where, if you can remember that upside down tunnel that we talked about, when you see people falling down constantly into those unhealthy or unhelpful choices, remind them and how to push them back up to those healthier things that they know how to do and they're just forgetting at the time. Changing the narrative, I think, is really, and this is as much for ourselves as it is for the people that we work with, it's about what we're learning, not what we're losing. There is a lot of loss going on right now. If we focus on that, we're going to be overwhelmed by grief. So I think it's really trying to figure out what we're learning. And that kind of moves into this bind of uncertainty. And Marnie's example, I think, was really excellent about Lake of the Ozarks. Keep that in your head, okay? When we feel uncertain about something, we tend to fall back on what we know, which is our own perceptions and beliefs. And that's why it's hard for us to take in new information, to be empathic to the needs of others, to figure out new ways to cope and adapt. And as we're watching, we need to be open-minded about some of the ways people deal with that bind of uncertainty with COVID, because, there were some of us who looked at that Lake of the Ozarks and thought, these are just self-centered people who won't care about anybody else. They were just reverting to what they knew because it could be so scary to confront the reality of what would happen if they had to wear masks or they had to socially distance. They couldn't go there. So again, sometimes helping people understand that our way of coping with uncertainty is to go back to the old ways may help them begin to incorporate some new stuff in here. The last piece of what we have on here is practicing self-compassion. And we think that this is so extraordinarily important that we have given you your activity in your workbook this week was really about self-compassion and how to look at that for yourself. It really means when you respond to yourself in the same way that you typically would respond to a close friend or a client when they're suffering. And I want to point out, this isn't just what you say to somebody else. Oh, I'm so sorry about that. Sounds like you did a good job. It's what you feel. You have to internalize this for yourself. You can't just give yourself that easy pass. This has got to be something that has real meaning to it. Because what we know is that there's research findings that actually suggest that people who have high scores on self-compassion inventories are also more resilient. And not just resilient in general, but resilient towards psychopathology. So they tend not to get depressed or fall in those holes as often. So this is another promising intervention for your clinical practice. And what we have done in your references, we are giving you some references online, so you don't have to go out and buy books. They're right there. You can go get them even now if you want. And there's one that has a self-compassion inventory in it. So you can take a look at that. And I think it's really important to incorporate into not just your own work, but work with clients. Those of you who are familiar with positive psychology and humanistic psychology are going to know what we're talking about. But for those of you who aren't, I really encourage you to look at it, because I think given the climate where we are in that outer community, this idea of self-compassion is essential. And what I'm going to do right now is turn this over to Laura to come up for a little bit of air.
So the poem we chose to reflect on the three kinds of resiliency, recovery, resistance, reconfiguration is by the Irish poet John O'Donoghue. And we really kind of want you to think about the metaphors in this poem. We want you to think about the wall, the bitter weather, the brush of doubt. This is the time to be slow. Lie low to the wall until the bitter weather passes. Try as best you can not to let the wire brush of doubt scrape from your heart all sense of yourself and your hesitant light. If you remain generous, time will come good, and you will find your feet again on fresh pastures of promise, where the air will be kind and blushed with beginnings.
Thank you, Laura. You've led us into a type of beginning, which is post-traumatic growth. And this kind of goes along with what Marnie was talking about with resilience. This is both a process and an outcome, and not everyone is capable of this. The equation of post-traumatic growth is a little disarming. Okay, you need to be able to live with the trauma and the accompanying feelings long enough to earn the wisdom that comes from it. So distress in and of itself doesn't generate post-traumatic growth. But let's talk a little bit about what it is. And in this section, I'm going to tell you that we've given you the seminal researcher, Tedeschi. We've given you references to him, so you don't need to worry about how to spell his name or find it. And in the summary for this week, we've really focused on post-traumatic growth, so you don't really need to even take any notes on this whole next section. You can just sort of listen if you would like. He says it's a metaphor, a response to trauma that is a transformation that goes beyond just your normal functioning. And he said that people develop new understandings of themselves, the world they live in, how they relate to other people, the kind of future that they could have, and a better understanding of how to live life. And the metaphor for this, I think, is really the earthquake. Because when you have an earthquake, it really produces such significant threats to existing structures that after the earthquake, almost everything has to be rebuilt, and it's rebuilt in a newer, stronger way. And I think that that's appropriate to kind of growth that takes place after there's been the trauma. So let's take a look at some of the outcomes of post-traumatic growth. And what I want to say here again is that everyone doesn't necessarily get growth in all of these areas. It's perception of self, interpersonal relationships, and their philosophy of life. So I want you to just kind of listen as we talk about this. And I want you to even think about yourself if you've seen some of these outcomes, maybe not from the distress or the trauma you've been currently in, but some of the situations you've experienced as you've lived your life. First of all, in post-traumatic growth, we look at the perception of self, and the first one is really, I think, the most significant, where we see ourselves often as victims. And as you know, victim is a very negative word, it's a powerless word, and you usually feel helpless. A survivor is someone who copes with a very bad situation and gets through. The very idea of being a survivor confers a special status and strength to people. And all I want you to do is think about the images you have seen of the people who have been discharged from hospitals after they've been in ICUs and on ventilators. They're survivors of COVID. And think of the corridors of hospital staff on either side as they're in a wheelchair or they're in a bed, cheering and having music playing and just giving them high fives. What it does is it really does give them that special status and strength and a sense of self-reliance that they're stronger having come through this. I don't know about you all, but you know, there's a commercial on television, I'm not even sure what it's for, but it's for a woman who survived, who was born in 1920. And she talks about surviving the flu epidemic, the Depression, the Great Wars, and here she is, she's back. She is a picture in my mind of self-reliance. And next time you see that, think about it, because I think she gives you that survivor self-reliance in such a profound, simple way. The other part of this, though, is kind of a paradox, because vulnerability is another perception of self that often comes as an outcome of post-traumatic growth, is a recognition of your own mortality and the fragility of life. A second outcome really can be seen in our interpersonal relationships. This is the ability to express positive feelings and emotional expressiveness. As we talked about, I believe, in our first week, there's a lot of the worried well who never would have been in therapy, who never would have gone for crisis counseling, who all of a sudden have done that and learned there's some degree of freedom in being able to express your thoughts and your feelings. I'm taken mostly to my group of 9/11 widows. As I mentioned before, we started this group in February of 2002, and it still meets all these years later. These were women who never would have met each other under any other circumstance. They came from different socioeconomic backgrounds. They came from different communities. They had nothing in common before September 11th, but they came together and they began to share their experiences. And over the course of time, even though this was a support group, kind of quasi got into therapy at times, they would talk about how wonderful it was to be expressive to each other in a way they had never been to their spouses. And they talked about all the accomplishments they had made in their lives that they probably wouldn't have made if their husbands had been alive. And they would laugh about those. And they couldn't share those with anybody else, but that was a piece because they had that bonding and they had that openness where they felt safe and trusted. Compassion and giving to others, we've talked about before. Especially, I think the picture here of the food bank, we've mentioned the food bank. You know, some types of trauma may really lead us to empathy training. We become more compassionate and giving to others. And I think, Marnie, you've got an example from your own neighborhood about some of this compassion and giving.
Yeah, Maureen, you know, when we were putting this together and we talked about how vulnerability can lead to empathy, compassion, and greater altruism, I quickly recalled the recent week when I did a grocery store run, and on my way, I saw a line of cars that went on for block after block after block. I found out later that all those cars were lined up to donate food to our local food bank. They were all, while still being vulnerable and affected by the situation, doing something for those who are even more vulnerable, which I think probably helped them feel, at least for a moment, a little less vulnerable. My town collected 40,000 pounds of food that day, one carload at a time. And I found out that they sat in those cars for those many blocks long wait to get to the food bank for sometimes up to an hour, to feel like part of a solution to a problem that for most of us feels too big to solve on a daily basis.
I think that's a great example, you know, and I want to say, those of you who are listening to this, my sense is that your level of compassion has been increased through COVID, because most of you are answering phones for crisis contacts. And I just want to, you know, kind of point out to you, can you continue that through the duration, or do you want some simpler ways to be compassionate and giving? You just want to put that out there for yourself, because again, we think of that cost to you in the work you're doing. The final outcome may seem a little airy-fairy. This is, you know, your philosophy about life, your appreciation about life. You know, any trauma that puts our lives in dangers. And I would, you know, kind of say to you, the level of fear that was put into all of our hearts that made us shelter in place, you know, has made, if you never get sick here and you make it to the end, I think you're going to feel like you've really been given a gift. You weren't personally affected physically by this. And it's a second chance that should be treated with more care. Those existential themes and that sense of meaning, those are the issues related to the purpose of life, the inevitability of personal death. Some of you know this all too well. You've had existential thoughts your entire lives. Some of you may not have a clue what I'm talking about. And if you haven't had an existential thought, good for you, because you just won't know it. But for some people, they're going to start to emerge during the course of COVID. And what we know about them is that they come and they go. They come, and it's a lot easier to think about them than figure out what they're all about. And most of the time, you can't. But they'll go away. The bad news is that they're probably going to come back. But I think that our jobs may be just normalizing that for people to understand that that's one of the things that come when we are presented with death in any way, shape, or form. Our own mortality gets into question. In terms of spiritual development, we've talked about this a lot and how people are affected by this either in positive or negative ways. I want to suggest to you that, you know, one of the things that you may do for yourself, just so you've got some more tools in your toolkit, is look at bibliotherapy and see if you can find some people who've written about spiritual themes that speak to you. John O'Donoghue, for example, has been my wisdom figure and mentor in terms of spiritual development, and I often turn to John's words. He's written a lot of books in addition to poems that really can help people on often what seems like that singular journey when you're looking for spiritual fulfillment. The idea of wisdom, you know, that's a tricky one in our culture. In other cultures, wisdom comes with age. As you know, I know, in our culture, that doesn't necessarily happen. But what it comes with in our culture are often experiences. And I think that's why we often hear children who have life-threatening illnesses, people will talk about them as having old souls, you know, and understanding the meaning of life. It's that experience, again, that proximity to death that can often make all of us pretty wise. So what are you going to do with this? Okay, here's how you put this into clinical practice. And we've been through this before, so this is going to be a very quick renew. You want to help people know that post-traumatic growth is a possibility, especially if they feel lost in that swamp of despair. It can happen, it just takes time, but you're going to allow for the time to come, and don't just jump into the possibility of post-traumatic growth, because it can be construed as minimizing their pain, loss, and suffering. You just have to wait until someone kind of begins to express that positive reaction to that event themselves. Sometimes I've heard people talk about it, it's the gift in all that suffering, and you just have to wait for that to help them. In the interim, though, I think you can help them identify what's meaningful in their lives and schedule some activities that are around those interests. I found, and they may be very plebeian. I've had people who, for gardening, you know, that was something that helped them just get their hands in that earth and feel some sense of aliveness when the rest of them felt dead. And you want to help people discover what their strengths are that help them get through those past traumas. So that family that lost two children, what helped them get through that second trauma of their second child dying was going back and looking at what the strengths were they used to get themselves through that first trauma. So I want to move us now to talk briefly about children in post-traumatic growth, because we know a lot of you are working with kids.
Yeah, so I am going to be brief, because the truth is the answer to this question, do children have the emotional and developmental maturity to experience post-traumatic growth? The answer is we don't know. And especially for children, I think the answer could be probably not. Here's what we know so far. We know that protective factors tend to inhibit post-traumatic growth. Tedeschi writes about a study that was done on children after Hurricane Katrina. They had thought that what they would see was that children who would be doing better in the aftermath were the ones with supportive parent figure. Instead, what they saw was those children were the same, if not worse off than children who did not have that supportive parent. The supportive parent tended to keep the child from experiencing distress, which is necessary for post-traumatic growth. So if post-traumatic growth requires confronting a trauma and experiencing it to its full impact, which most children are developmentally unprepared to do, it seems that post-traumatic growth might not often occur with children. That being said, adolescents might be another story, since they are more capable of confronting some of those uncomfortable feelings and sitting with them. I'm honestly curious what's going to happen in the next coming years. I think there'll be lots of studies coming out based on our children and what's been happening with them. And now I think we're going to go to a poll. So this is a bit of a commercial break. As you all know, we are looking to do more of these webinars, and we're targeting one specifically for school staff coming up soon over this summer, early or late summer. So this is for school staff to answer. The idea here is, don't just tell me your favorite week to have a webinar, but let me know all of the weeks in which you could attend a webinar on school return to learn. And I'm watching nobody answer right now. Oh, there we go. I just had a little bit of a tape delay. Okay. And while people are answering, the other quick commercial interruption, because I'm getting this question a lot, is that it is our intention to have all 4 webinar recordings in one place on a YouTube channel. That YouTube channel will also be linked from all of the partner websites, from the SPTS website, from the MHA website, and from the YMCA website. So that's to come. We've just been working on getting the content out, and then we'll get to that. Oh, great. You guys are even putting things in chat. Thank you so much for letting us know what the situation is. So great. So we'll keep you posted. I have your emails, and be on the lookout also for information as it comes out through MHA about going forward. So I'm going to end the poll and keep those results for me for later. And I'm going to go ahead and move on to getting towards the home stretch. So the bridge in this picture is another metaphor. Were you counting how many metaphors we used today? When I giggled to myself when Maureen said swamp of despair, just personally. So we did use a lot today, and honestly, a couple were intentional, but once you start thinking about metaphor and looking at life through that lens, they just kind of come out. Some of them weren't necessarily intentional. Just like this bridge, however, how to get from where we are now to where we're going is still under construction. As we said from the start, we're in a place we've never been before, and we're all learning together firsthand in real time right now. You know, our team collectively has years of experience with trauma, which has helped us shape this series for you. But the pandemic isn't like anything we've ever seen before. So I don't want you to think that the next slide is going to be this really polished 5-point plan for taking steps out of the darkness that we're all surviving through right now into the light of thriving. We don't have that at hand. None of us do. But what we do have is some ideas for what's next. But to move forward, it's important to take a look at where we've been. What I wanted to do was take a moment to talk about your biggest takeaways from the last 4 weeks. And I got these from your evaluations because, like I said, all along, we're paying attention to what you're telling us. So in week 1, we talked about how trauma affects our lives. Your biggest takeaways were support, control, structure, self-care, 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 come up for air every hour, validate your client's worldview, and 2 + 2 = 4, which was shorthand for doing routine problem solving to get your brain back online. In week 2, we talked about navigating grief and loss. Your biggest takeaways were loss is loss is loss, come up for air, that's this twice now, Worden's tasks of grief, supporting people into helpful, separating people into helpful, harmful, and neutral when trying to identify trusted adults with adolescents. Mary and John's story about obsessive review, why Mary just needs to do it. Good old Mary. The importance of validating losses, that's, by the way, validate twice too, and stop trying to be so positive and fix everything. In week 3, we looked at when hope is lost and suicide becomes an option. Your biggest takeaways were tell me more, ventilate and validate, that's 3 for validate, support, control, structure, the tunnel of cognitive constriction, which you all call the upside down triangle, to be direct with questions about suicide and to ask early, and that the mind can be a dangerous neighborhood, so don't go there alone. Which is bringing me up to today, where we begin to look ahead and how we're going to come through this. I look forward to seeing your takeaways from today in the evaluations. That's my other plug for the evaluation. Maureen's going to take us to where we're going.
Okay, thanks, Marnie. Well, as Marnie has just said, we're not going to give you the 7 steps to a happy life. And what we've listed on here are some of the topics we're considering for our next series of monthly webinars. These came from what you suggested on your evaluations. I'm not going to review it. You can read it. And if there's a topic you'd like to add, you can put it on your evaluation this week, or you can email that to Marnie. What I want to briefly address is the future for ourselves as helpers, as caregivers, as teachers, and I think as simply human beings. There's a great possibility we're going to be continuing through a time marked by distress, by loss, by public dissension, and of course, death. The universe may spare us with a miraculously quick vaccine, but if it doesn't, we need to think about how we're going to choose to explain the continuing impact of COVID on some of our most vulnerable, first to ourselves and then to those that we're working with, because it's not going to go away. Laura and I often talk about the river beneath the river, what's going on below our consciousness. This is a river that's going to continue to flow, and it may get wild and rough at times, and we ignore it at our peril. Even if you're not caught in the currents, there are those who are around you who will be. And that's why we're encouraging you to take time for yourself, organize your thoughts and feelings and coping strategies around the continuing needs that are going to be there for COVID. And what do you need to do that? What a big surprise. We're going to give you another poll.
Here I come with the poll. Okay. What do you need to move forward? Great. So here's the poll. I'm launching it for you right now. What do you need to move forward? As usual, put your ideas in the chat. I think sometimes you guys are better helping yourself than we are. I think you're learning from yourselves a ton. You know, I just want to say that rest came up really fast. My whole team is really looking forward to some rest as well. I'm setting my alarm tomorrow morning, that is for sure. Okay, so people are answering in the poll. If you have any other ideas, put them in the chat. All right, and I'm just keeping track of time. I'm going to wrap it up just so that we can not keep you too long. I'm going to share the results. Rest was the #1 answer.
Yes.
You also want to make sure you're having conversations with colleagues, that you're getting resources and support, and that you're having compassion for yourself. Those were the top ones. My request for you all is to think about one of those things that you need to move forward and figure out how you're going to do it. Now, it's easy for me because I don't have a webinar next Wednesday, so I know I'm going to get to have some rest, and a lot of you have the same old thing again tomorrow, which I totally get. But whatever it is you want, you need to move forward. Think of one thing that you can do today or this week. Again, those immediate steps, not long-term planning, to get what you need, because that's how we get what we need, one step at a time. I'm going to stop sharing the results because I'm going to turn it over to Laura, who's going to bring us home with a beautiful blessing.
This is Blessing the Boats by Lucille Clifton. May the tide that is entering even now the lip of our understanding carry you out beyond the face of fear. May you kiss the wind, then turn from it, certain it will love you back, your back. May you open your eyes to water, water waving forever, and may you in your innocence sail through this to that. Okay, so I just want to say what a blessing it is to work with everybody here. This kind of work gives me hope. I'm grateful for you all, professionals coming together to learn, to teach, to get even better at helping others and helping yourselves. You have my email on the slide, lwinters@cse.edu. It's on there. And, you know, it would be nice if this work on metaphor prompted you to get some of your ideas down on paper. I'd be happy to work with you on that. I hope we meet again. Peace be with you.
I want to take a minute to say goodbye in my own way. So I'm not quite sure what I'm going to do without all of you. The last 4 weeks have been so full because of you. Shelter in place had made my world small. And then this project, and most importantly, all of you, made it so much bigger. And for that, I'm extremely grateful. Like most things worth doing, I got more from this than I gave. And working with our faculty team of bright and dedicated people was amazing. I want to give a huge thanks out both to the team that you all saw on the faculty team and all those behind the scenes, especially the staff at MHA of Monmouth County who were there for us and made this happen. Tomorrow and maybe Friday too, I'm going to catch up on some rest. But next Wednesday, I think I will pause and miss you, even though my family will be glad that I'm not banning them from the Wi-Fi for 2 hours to preserve my own bandwidth. I wish all of you the best. Don't forget to complete your evaluations, and Maureen's going to share her final thoughts.
Thanks, Marnie. I know my grandson joins Marnie's family. He's grateful now that he can come over for lunch, as he did in the middle of our first webinar, and you know, you never saw him after that. So I know he's grateful that my time has opened up again. And one of the things that I want to say to you all is I absolutely know the value of time as clinicians, as teachers, and I think simply as people these days. We've become overwhelmed and multitaskers, despite the fact that when this began, it was sort of like we were all on snow days. It doesn't feel like that anymore. And the fact that you all have chosen to spend 6 hours of what I consider to be valuable time with us, and not just spending the time, but on really, really tough topics, has just been very, very humbling to me. And I want to also say, just as Laura and Marnie have, that you've also helped me feel a part of community of caring. That I'm going to take with me as I continue my journey through COVID. This has really been a gift to my spirit, and I really know that I am not going to be alone because I have a sense of connection to you all, and that I really believe we're going to meet again. So thank you all so very much for giving us your time, your energy, and your compassion for these last 4 weeks.
So more to come. Thank you all so much. We'll see you this summer.
Bye.
Bye.